My name is Keenan Fry, and this is my research proposal for Instructional Research Design 797. The case for a self determination intervention encouraging post secondary populations to engage with weight control behaviors. This report slash proposal, however you want to phrase it, was very difficult to write. It took a considerable amount of time to construct. Um, and I want to begin by dedicating it to a student who I will leave as code name Claire. Um, Claire was a student of mine who I worked with in post secondary education who passed away in what would have been fall of 2021. I'm going to talk more about that in just a second. So I've got an abstract here, and essentially the abstract is just addressing the topic of weight control and trying to limit the conversation to a specific population, that is post-secondary populations. It talks a little bit about what protected status is, protected persons due to the status of being disabled, and then I go on a little bit about weight control and quality of life. Um, so this is my justification. There's a couple of points here about diminished autonomy and the nature that disabled persons have this designation of being having diminished autonomy, and then due to the designation that they have diminished or reduced autonomy, they require additional support and protections. This is talked about in the Belmont report quite extensively. So this portion of the justification is very light, but I'm going to now talk a little bit about Codename Claire and tell you about that experience. Um, I've got experience working in post secondary education, doing a lot of OTPT work. Uh, and what that was is on consult, so an occupational therapist, a physical therapist, or the other one is called OI, orthopedic impairment, which is part of OT. I would work under a credentialed individual with one of those three credentials, OT, PT, OI, and I would provide occupational or physical therapy rehabilitation services under that consult. So essentially, I'm not credentialed, but I would get special training and then I would administer treatment on behalf of the credentialed person. And this was due to the limitations of staffing. And one of the students I was supposed to work with was codenamed Claire, who was a student with Down syndrome and a relatively significant intellectual impairment. And she also had the comorbidity of epilepsy. And she also had a third comorbidity, which was her status of being obese. So there's a portion of this document that talks about Richardson versus Chicago, which talks about the nature of what a disability is, what qualifies for disabled, and they've talked about the non realistic result. This is on, I believe, page 16 of the Justina article that I've linked at the back of my selected sources. Hang on. It would be the right here, the Flom and Schroeder document. That's going to be the one that's hosted on Justina Law. That's the actual publication of Richardson versus Chicago, and I believe it's page 16 if I remember correctly. And then if you don't want to read it, what you can do is jump into this bottom one down here about the Seventh Circuit. But anyway, Richardson asks the question, the Richardson versus CTA, which is Chicago Transit Authority. So you'll hear those names thrown around: Richardson versus Chicago, Richardson versus CTA. It's the same case. You'll hear the question thrown around about what is disability, what qualifies, and what's a protected status. And what Richardson does, it establishes the court opinion that disability is something that is connected to an underlying physiological condition. So essentially, obesity without an underlying physiological condition is not a disability. So it creates what would be considered a testing parameter for what is actually a qualifying condition. That is something that has an underlying physiological connection. Um, that being the justification for striking down Richardson's appeal to be protected due to his status of being obese. So what this essentially does is it establishes a precedent which is favorable to the AMA. So there's a couple of organizations. There's the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then there's multiple versions of the act. It's been amended and so forth. It was amended in the 90s. It was amended in 2008 under the Obama administration. Technically, it was established in the 1970s as IDEA Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and then it transformed into the ADA. So there's a long history to what the ADA is. I'm not going to go into that, but essentially what it boils down to is there's a line in the sand, and on one side you have the ADA and their regulatory branch, which is the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And then on the other side, you have the AMA, which is the American Medical Association, and arguably the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. And the two sides of the argument are trying to figure out who has the better opinion on what qualifies for disability. And there's a big portion of my literature review addressing this topic because I try to create the framework for a moral question to be applied to this intellectual exercise because there seems to be a lot of ethical standards being thrown around, but I see a moral bankruptcy behind those ethics. While people are debating this topic and are debating should we do something, if we do something, what should we do, so on and so forth, I've personally witnessed people die. And it is my opinion that something does need to be done and action is called for, but that the action needs to be reasonable and measured. And my opinion is that we should try to implement an intervention strategy that is designed to target post secondary populations to give them the means of self determination. These are individuals with diminished autonomy, so empowering them to engage in a means of self determination is critical because there's many facets of self determination. I particularly reflect upon the standards that are related to uh, self determination through ECC, the expanded core curriculum. So, again, brief selection of sources. That would be the Ullman and Lewis source. That's where they talk about teaching the expanded core curriculum to students with visual impairments. The scope of my project is not to specifically address students with visual impairments, but all post secondary populations. So a little bit of background information on post-secondary populations and what makes them special and unique. Post-secondary populations do not get a high school diploma, which is one of the reasons why they have a protected status because there is some kind of impairment that is significant enough to impair them from completing their high school diploma. So what that means is that in California, and that's another limitation that needs to be very clearly stated. This can only apply to the state of California because of the nature of post secondary education in California is going to be different from all the other states. There is generalizable sort of structures and findings in this proposal that can result in this proposal being adapted to other states and other populations. I'll go into that later. The big thing, though, is that in the state of California, you don't get a high school diploma if you are in post secondary. And so what ends up happening is you get a kid who's on an IEP, they either graduate diploma track or they complete high school with a certificate. if they complete the diploma track, they are removed from special education services and they continue on with their life however it is they see fit. If, however, they do not complete their high school education with a diploma and they complete their high school education instead with a certificate, those persons who complete with a certificate instead of the diploma are entitled to an additional 4 years of education in the form of post secondary education. So, post secondary populations are students who have a significant enough impairment that prevents them from completing high school. So, these are people who have diminished autonomy, they haven't completed high school, and they need to receive educational interventions, resources, and supports to help them make their own most informed decisions. And I try to create a moral imperative or framework for that concept because there's a great deal of ethical conversations that are right now the subject of debate. Again, what it is we should do, should we even do something? And I think the answer is resounding and obvious. Yes, we should do something. And what I attempt to do is to state what it is that should be done. So that's kind of like this project slide right here. There's 3 phases: pre production, production, post production. Some of the qualitative measures include A1C testing, that's blood sugar. BIA is bioelectric impedance, which is they shoot an electrical pulse through a scale, and you have a handlebar in your hands, and that completes the circuit, and they measure the amount of resistance to the electrical charge to help figure out what your fat content and what your liquid content is in your body composition. And then there's BMI, which is a metric, which is a height, weight, and waist ratio metric. So that's your height, your waist size, and your weight itself. And then those are my quantitative measures for triangulation. And then I have qualitative measures, which are going to be home journals, school journals, which are going to be very much subjective to the nature of coding, and that's going to be very much qualitative. That's where I'm going to get a lot of reflective data on how students engage in the process, how they reflect on the process. There are some more quantitative metrics. There's the ARC measure of self-determination that I don't really include in the project slide. It's a tool for measuring a student's level of self-determination using a questionnaire. I plan on including that as sort of a 6th form of triangulation, which is a quantitative metric for qualitative measures, if that somehow makes sense. I don't know exactly how to describe it besides that. But anyway, I have basically 5, technically 6 forms of triangulation. I have 3 that are quantitative and 3 that are qualitative, basically qualitative. And that's me trying to create 2 different sets of triangulation. Pre-production is 30 days. That's just interviewing, getting information. Production is 60 days. Post-production is 12 months. The production process is going to go through all the testing procedures, and then post-production is going to be a 12-month recap, to see if they're still engaging in those practices. So what we're trying to do is teach the kids, well, they're not kids, they're students because they're all relatively 18 to 22, but try to teach the students what weight control means, how to regulate their diet, how to regulate their caloric intake, and it has to be age appropriate, and it also has to be cognitively appropriate for these students. Again, these are students who have not graduated high school due to some kind of combination of impairments, including usually intellectual impairments. So it has to be something that's on a cognitive level that they can appreciate. What that means will vary But the general sort of unifying designation is these are all post-secondary populations. But to give you an example, at my particular job site, there's five, technically six different classrooms. Um, and essentially, the way that works is you have, relatively speaking, five or maybe six clusters of intellectual capacity that are stratified across the program. So, depending on which class you use out of the six available, which class you would use as the experimental group, you would have to adjust the intervention to sort of meet that intellectual strata. I'm more inclined to use the higher end of the strata because there's two classes that very clearly parallel each other on the upper end of the strata, and they're relatively of the same intellectual capacity. And so the way I would initially target this intervention is to target the highest functioning upper two classes to see if it could just be implemented at a level that they could understand before additional reductions are applied to the program to make it intellectually appropriate for lower functioning students so that they could still get something of meaning from it. So, how does this relate back to Codename Claire? She died in October of 2021. I was technically on her caseload because she was being evaluated for uh, various services. I believe she was being evaluated for PT and OT, if I remember correctly. In Claire's case, she had what I believe was an enlarged heart, and she had a series of seizures late at night that then resulted in her heart failure. And her heart failure was exasperated by her obesity, which put additional strain on her heart. So she had the seizures, which were putting strain on her heart, but then additional strain being put on her heart due to her status of being obese. And then her heart itself was weak from the onset due to her having Downs. And this resulted in a lethal combination that prematurely ended her life. Um, the reason why that's one of the many sources of impetus to this uh, document, to this study, is that uh, it was decided that Codename Claire was not going to engage in her OT PT services because she had an injury, and it was decided that it was too risky for her to engage in those services due to the liability of her potentially aggravating her existing injury. So effectively, what the decision was that Codename Claire would not receive the services she needed. And what ultimately occurred was a slippery slope. And I find it somewhat difficult to say that because obviously there's the slippery slope fallacy, but in essence, it was a slow, gradual decline. That was something that the researcher witnessed firsthand, um, and it was a preclusion to uh, codename Claire's ultimately untimely and premature death. So what does this mean? Students with diminished autonomy don't necessarily have the means to make decisions for themselves, or at the very least, they don't have the means to make the best decisions for themselves. And some amount of intervention is always going to be necessary and is always going to be justified. It's going to vary on the intellectual capacity of the individual. The proposal here is not to necessarily create an intervention, but to just find interventions that are available on the marketplace and to go through them and figure out which ones are the best. And so, what this does is it proposes a testing methodology, which methods are the best for trying to endow these students with diminished autonomy a greater sense of autonomy by encouraging them to engage in self-regulated behaviors, which is a tenet of self-determination theory. There's a lot in the ECC Essentials about encouraging self-determination theory, principles, and practices in, visually impaired students. But again, I believe that's a universal standard that could be applied to pretty much any student in post-secondary education. And it is therefore the imperative of this study to try and foster that independent desire to regulate one's own well-being. By no means does this article attempt to disqualify these persons from making decisions for themselves. It simply seeks to give them the information necessary to make the best informed decision for their own safety. There's a proposal for a series of coding methodologies that are really strictly based around the phrases of self-determination theory as outlined in Ullman and Lewis, ECC Essentials. And I think that that's one of the principal metrics. The other one is a moral imperative metric that was created by the author of the study called the Holyfield-Peterson measure for self-determination, the HPMSD, and it's essentially a two-part sort of standard that tries to address two very abstract concepts, one being sacrifice, the other being discipline, to try and measure the student's willingness to respond to this higher calling of self-determination. I apologize for the length of this video. I'm looking at the recording and it's already 23 minutes going on. But I appreciate you taking the time to hear me explain this to you. It was very complicated writing this. I've been working on this document for the better part of a year. Since last spring, I started working on this topic of obesity in post-secondary populations, and I'm very much interested in pursuing this as a research proposal because I think that there's a very clear and immediate impact that it has. Obviously, having watched students die, and watching multiple students have severe disabilities, be impaired by additional disabilities or additional diseases is not something that I think anyone wants to endure. The purpose of this is to essentially reduce human suffering, which the author has witnessed a great deal of, and it is in the author's intent and interest to try and address those concepts as best as possible in the most responsible manner as possible, to reduce the difficulty, the suffering, and struggles faced by post-secondary populations by empowering them to engage in legitimate means of self-determination as much as they can individually achieve to their own. What was it? Carlo Rossi, one of my mentors, once said, to each individual to their individual capacity according to their individual needs. The purpose of this study is to address each individual to their individual capacity to achieve self-determination according to their individual needs to address self-determination within their own life. And I think that's the best way to summarize this. Thank you for your time. I'm Keenan Fry, and I appreciate you watching this video.